My name is Elliot Chu, and I'm the Interim Dean of the College of Science at the University of Arizona. Today's lecture is called Water Within the Ocean. Our lecturer is Diane Thompson, who is an assistant professor in the Department of Geosciences here at the University of Arizona. Diane came to the University of Arizona in 2018 and is the director of the Biosphere 2 Marine Research Laboratory. In 2020, she received an NSF Early Career Award. The lecture today will concentrate on oceans, and as you may know, oceans uptake huge amounts of heat and moderate the world's temperatures. Recently, temperatures have increased immensely and have put certain ecosystems at risk. Diane's going to explore both the increases and their impact on coral reefs and discuss possible solutions that could help save our reefs.
I'm Diane Thompson from the Department of Geosciences at the University of Arizona. Today we're going to take a journey to the depths of the seafloor and back again here to the Biosphere 2 at the University of Arizona to explore our oceans, the world's largest reservoir of water. To begin, I want to start with a quote from an inspiring female ocean scientist, Sylvia Earle, who's explored the depths of the ocean by submarine. She says, "Even if you've never had the chance to see or touch the ocean touches you with every breath you take, every drop of water you drink, and every bite you consume." Everyone, everywhere is inextricably connected and utterly dependent on the existence of the sea. So today we'll explore how our oceans have shaped Earth's climate, how our oceans are changing now and throughout Earth's history, and how we can harness this knowledge to build resilience for our future. So for those of you who attended last week's lecture, we heard about the origins of water in our solar system. The uniqueness of our water planet is evident from space, where we can immediately get drawn to the vast expanses of our oceans, which cover over 70% of the Earth's surface. Here we look down on the Pacific Ocean, the world's largest ocean basin, which stretches over 12,000 miles from Asia and Australia to here in the Americas, peeking over the horizon on the top right of this view from space. However, the Pacific hasn't always been this large. This NASA animation shows what we'd see if we drain our oceans, leaving behind the evidence of their evolution and even the reason for their existence. Our oceans have been shaped through Earth's history as rigid plates move over the viscous layer like peanut butter beneath, fueled by convection currents. New rock material is created where plates move apart, and seafloor and rocks are destroyed in areas where they collide. We owe the very existence of our ocean basins to the density differences between this rock material that forms our continents and that of the seafloor, with the continental material quite literally buoyed above the dense oceanic rocks that form our seafloor. So now I'm going to play this animation again, and you'll notice the difference in depth between this shallow continental shelf material, which drains first in the animation, and the deep oceanic plains that are over 4 kilometers deep and spread away from these mid-ocean mountain ranges called mid-ocean ridges, which then cool and deepen as the crust spreads away from the ridges. Finally, you'll see these deep oceanic trenches, the deepest parts of our ocean, which plummet to as much as 11 kilometers or 36,000 feet deep. In fact, the deepest oceanic trench, known as the Challenger Deep, is deeper than Mount Everest is tall. It is therefore easy to see how the vast majority, in fact over 97% of the water on Earth, is in our oceans. However, this water is salty and therefore largely unusable to us as humans and other life on Earth. And this is exacerbated the fact that the majority of the remaining water is locked up in our ice sheets, leaving less than 1% available for fresh water to drink. We rely on this small fraction of water, yet it too can be traced back to our oceans, with over 85% of it sourced from evaporation off the surface of the oceans. The remainder of it is sourced off of small bodies like lakes and rivers, as well as off the leaves of plants in a process called transpiration. In addition to being the ultimate source of our fresh water, our oceans are the critical heat engine for Earth's weather and climate, redistributing energy from where there's abundance in the tropics to where there's a deficit at the poles. About a third of this energy is transported by ocean currents and turbulent eddies. That is, large and small vortices you see here that are similar to hurricanes in the atmosphere, that trap heat and literally spin off, carrying energy, nutrients, and life with them. The Gulf Stream shown here in the North Atlantic is a powerful example. Without the energy transport to high latitudes by this current, Europe would be much colder than it is today. As we move to the South Atlantic here to the tip of Africa, you can see more of these turbulent eddies that spin off of the Agulhas Current and transport energy from the Indian to the Atlantic Ocean. This energy transport by our oceans is equivalent to about 500,000 tons of TNT per second, or more than 30 Hiroshima bombs every second of every day. Put another way, this is over 500 times the amount of energy the US consumes in any given year. Another 2/3 of this energy is transported by the atmosphere, by the direct transfer of heat, and by the latent energy that's released when gaseous water condenses and falls as rain, both in the tropical rain belt you see here, as well as these high latitude storms that spin off and dump rain in both hemispheres. Again, this energy is ultimately sourced from the water that evaporates off the ocean surface. Finally, our oceans also play a critical role in shaping Earth's response to past, present, and future climate changes. For example, today, global air temperatures are rising in direct response to carbon dioxide and other greenhouse gases which trap and re-radiating heat in the climate system. Here I show Earth's average temperature from 1880 on the left to present on the right, along with atmospheric carbon dioxide, which has been measured by Mauna Loa, Hawaii since 1958. You can see that the rising air temperatures track carbon dioxide levels since the Industrial Revolution. The acceleration of warming in recent decades has primarily been caused by the release of greenhouse gases when we burn fossil fuels for energy production, which counts for about 69% of global emissions, which is 32 gigatons, or 1 billion metric tons, or 2 trillion pounds of carbon dioxide. The second largest contributor is land use change, which accounts for about 24% and is due to things like agriculture and deforestation. We have confirmed the direct link between carbon dioxide and greenhouse gases from ancient bubbles of atmospheric gas that are trapped in the Greenland and Antarctic ice sheets, which provide information about the composition of Earth's atmosphere in the past 800,000 years. You can see in these images of a sample of ice being held up by light, you can literally see these gas bubbles with the naked eye. Scientists can quite literally tap into these bubbles of Earth's ancient atmosphere and study the composition of Earth's past air. Similarly, the ice itself holds fingerprints of Earth's temperature. Putting these two together, shown here in blue and orange, we can see the strong link between carbon dioxide and Earth's temperature over the last 800,000 years, rising and falling in step with each other through Earth's glacial interglacial cycles. With high temperatures and high CO2 during our current interglacials, and low CO2 and low temperature during glacial periods. However, we can also see the unprecedented nature of recent climate changes, which are currently happening on the order of decades, when these past changes happened over hundreds or even thousands of years. So we know that CO2 is rising, and we have continuous, direct, reliable measurements of CO2 in our atmosphere going back to 1958. But this warming does not exactly follow this year-to-year changes in greenhouse gases and carbon dioxide. Rather, we see this stair-step warming pattern, with decades of really rapid warming followed by decades of slowdown or even cooling of Earth's temperature. So the question becomes, where does all this heat go when the atmospheric warming stalls? During the early 2000s, when one of these intervals where Earth's climate seemingly slowed down despite this continued rise of greenhouse gases, we went to work to figure out where this missing heat was. And what we found is that the slowdown in atmospheric warming can be attributed to the role of our oceans in taking up heat. In fact, about 90% of the excess heat that's been released in recent decades has actually gone into our ocean, and only 2% has remained in the atmosphere. Therefore, what we found is that in decades when the atmospheric warming slowed, oceanic warming accelerated. This temporarily mitigated the worst effects that we feel here in the atmosphere, but really trapped that heat for future release, exacerbating future warming. We see this trade-off in ocean heat content plotted here, which is really the integrated heat in the Earth's oceans, in such that in decades where the atmospheric warming slowed, oceanic warming accelerated, mirroring what's happening in the atmosphere. Similarly, about a quarter, 25% of the carbon dioxide that's released is also taken up by our oceans, directly by ocean mixing and air-sea exchange, but also by very small microscopic plants that live in the surface water. Like our rainforests, the lungs of the Earth, these tiny marine organisms use light and carbon dioxide and sequester that carbon down into the deep ocean, partially offsetting the exacerbated effects of human-induced climate change. So our oceans are doing us a huge favor, taking up both heat and carbon dioxide. However, this uptake of carbon by our oceans also comes with a hidden cost. As we increase the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, more and more of it is taken up by the surface ocean. And when carbon dioxide mixes with water, it becomes a weak acid, much the way soda becomes acidic when carbonated. So once in the ocean, this carbon dioxide reacts with water to form this weak acid that we call carbonic acid. As a weak acid like vinegar, it dissociates, meaning it breaks apart into its constituent parts, releasing hydrogen ions. In turn, these free hydrogen ions lower pH in a process known as ocean acidification. But some of these free hydrogen ions also combine with another form of carbon called carbonate in the oceans, decreasing the abundance of this key ion. This is critical because only a small fraction, in fact less than 10% of carbon in the oceans is in this critical form of carbonate, an ion that along with calcium is a key building block of the shells of many marine organisms, including corals, which we'll see later are framework reef builders, these microscopic species of plants that utilize carbon dioxide, and even planktonic snails. This tremendously complicated system that we see here then is changing in real time, increasing the abundance of carbon dioxide and hydrogen ions while reducing pH and the abundance of this key building block, carbonate, making it more and more difficult for organisms to grow their shells, moving from a healthy coral reef environment we see on the left to one with more and more degraded and more deformed shells on the right. This is really in turn impacting the entire marine food web. So given their importance for Earth's heat, water, and carbon, how have the oceans changed throughout Earth's history? With over 4.5 billion years of Earth's history to cover, that would be more than a lecture series on its own. So instead today I will show examples from my own work on relatively recent changes in the Pacific Ocean. But this is a great place to start because not only is the Pacific Ocean vast, but climate extremes in the tropical Pacific have a global impact. Record-breaking warm years have increased in recent decades, as indicated by red here in this plot of global surface air temperature over the 20th century, from 1900 on the left to 2020 on the right. We see that not only have these records become more frequent, but nearly all of the extreme warm years have happened when the Pacific was also abnormally warm. We can see this if we look at the 2015-2016 extreme warm year, which coincided with warm conditions in the Pacific. On the left is a plot that shows the record set in January to December of 2016, with the red colors indicating record warmth. On the right, you see here the surface air temperature departures or deviations from normal over the tropical Pacific Ocean, which really show warm conditions stretching across the tropical Pacific. So in other words, warm years in the Pacific tend to be warm years all over the world. These extreme conditions are caused by year-to-year changes in winds in the Pacific. In normal years, there's strong winds that blow from east to west. You can imagine like an industrial fan blowing across a bathtub. This piles warm waters up in the western Pacific and pushes them away from the east off the coast of South America. These surface waters are replaced by cold waters from depths, leading to a strong temperature gradient with cool waters in the east and warm waters in the west. But every few years, the winds, this industrial fan, weaken, and that warm water sort of sloshes across the Pacific, extending from the central to the eastern part of the basin, in an event that we call El Niño, or the Christ child when translated directly, due to its timing around Christmas and impact on South American fisheries. But these events also impact weather conditions across the Pacific and around the globe. For example, here in the southwest US, these events impact our winter rains. This is a view over the northern Pacific and western North America, showing high-intensity winter storms that we call atmospheric rivers. These events are more common in El Niño years when the warm waters in the Pacific increase the amount of water evaporated off the ocean surface, transported to North America, hitting the Rocky Mountains and dumping on us here in the West. This animation shows literally the total amount of water through the entire atmosphere from surface to space, showing what looks like a wall of water that hits the Sierras and the Rocky Mountains and dumps on us here in the southwestern US. Similarly, the band of warm water that extends across the Pacific during El Niño events impacts the position of what we call the global rain belt. This is a band of heavy rain that tracks the north-south migration seasonally and from year to year of sunlight and warm temperatures near the equator. It fuels heavy rainfall shown here in green. So as I play this animation, you can see how this green rain band moves north and south, but you can also see how during 2015-2016 El Niño, it gets sucked further south and east, leaving these low-lying atolls that I have circled here in black, high and dry and in a severe drought. These narrow strips of land lie right at or just above sea level, and their shallow freshwater resources are therefore vulnerable to the drought, wind, and waves associated with El Niño events. As a result, many of these low-lying atolls are projected to become uninhabitable by 2040, not due to sea level rise alone, but by the inundation of their shallow freshwater resources that are becoming increasingly contaminated with salt. During my career, I first got interested in El Niño due to their impact on coral reef ecosystems, which become increasingly stressed by the extreme temperatures that occur during these events. For example, during this same 2015-2016 El Niño year, many corals went from being really healthy in 2014 to bleaching and dying within the year. These events are becoming increasingly common and more severe, threatening coral reefs all over the world. Between 2014 and 2017, more than 75% of the Earth's coral reefs experienced bleaching level heat stress, with mortality at over 30% of these reefs. During coral bleaching, corals expel symbiotic algae that live in their tissue and give them much of their energy. Corals may die and become overgrown with weedy algae if they're unable to recover, undermining the reef structures like the one shown here. This is really critical because coral reefs provide a number of goods and services to society that go well beyond their beauty. Services that are worth an estimated $3.5 billion in the US alone. For example, coral reefs are a source of food for millions. They protect our coastlines from storms and erosion. They provide habitat, spawning, and nursery ground for important fishery species. They provide jobs and income to local economies through fishing, recreation, and tourism. They're a source of new medicines, and critically, they're hotspots of marine biodiversity. Fortunately, my work has also shown that the history of these El Niño events also shapes patterns of resilience. Here we show the temperatures at which corals bleach, which we call the bleaching threshold, across the tropical Pacific. You can see that in most places it only requires about a degree of warming in order for corals to bleach. But in the central and eastern Pacific, where El Niño is frequent and intense, it requires up to 4 degrees Celsius of warming. In other words, corals are less susceptible to bleaching in areas where El Niño is strong and frequent because of this history of heat stress. This discovery altered the course of my own career. You can see this young girl here on the left as an aspiring marine scientist. And she would have never imagined that she would one day actually be taking cores, poking holes in corals to study the history of ocean change. So now, to assess how oceans have changed in the past, my group here at the University of Arizona studies one of ocean's own historians, the reef-building corals themselves, who record fingerprints of ocean changes in their skeletons as they grow. Corals can live as much as a few hundred years old, recording temperature, salinity, and even windiness of the environment around them as they grow. This is a time-lapse video taken by my student Emma Reed of our team coring one of these massive corals in the Marshall Islands. This is a colony that grew in the lagoon a few hundred years ago, but has since died and been deposited upside down on the beach by a large wave or storm event. Like the growth rings on trees, you can literally see the growth bands etched in the side of this coral, marking the passage of time. For those of you like me, worried about the impacts of this on the coral, I can thankfully say that no corals are lost in the collection of these valuable samples. Although we take a small portion of the colony, the rest is left unharmed, and we actually plug the hole with these concrete plugs you see here to prevent other organisms from quite literally boring into the colony and weakening it from the inside. And corals have a remarkable ability to heal wounds by transporting energy and healing compounds within the colony, growing sideways over the surface of the concrete plug. In fact, my teenage self and my inner coral reef ecologist was relieved when I returned to the first site in the Galapagos that we cored, to not only not be able to find the corals that we cored, but to see that they could actually grow over the surface in only a few years between trips. So we take samples of living and dead coral colonies like the ones shown here, growing either in the ocean today and living, or growing a few hundred years ago. And we can use these corals to reconstruct ocean conditions at the time each one grew, providing a window of past ocean conditions. Splitting these core samples open, you can see the alternating growth bands like the rings of a tree. These seasonal density bands in the skeleton allow us to develop a precise chronology of variations going back through time. Back in my laboratory, we painstakingly sample these cores, literally millimeter by millimeter, as shown here in this time-lapse video by my graduate student, Emma Reed, processing one of our cores. And then when we go back to the lab here on the right, we can use geochemical fingerprints in the skeleton of past ocean conditions. We use what's called a mass spectrometer, shown here, which literally uses that large magnet you see in the center of the picture to bend the constituents of each sample based on the weight of each molecule. In turn, we use these coral records to understand how the tropical Pacific has changed during past extremes, recording changes in typhoons, El Nino, the rain belts, winds, sea level, and even coral's ability to buffer against changing ocean conditions and grow the reef structure that we rely on. Each piece of evidence helps us to paint a picture of how the tropical Pacific Ocean has changed in the past. So we're fortunate that the Pacific serves as a natural laboratory with contrasting conditions from those cool, variable conditions in the east to the warm, relatively stable conditions of the west and the Marshall Islands where we work, permitting us to study the sensitivity of these environments to past, present, and future climate changes. For example, at our newest site in the Marshall Islands, there are many coral boulders thrown on the beaches like the ones shown here, each of which provide a snapshot of climate over its lifetime. Piecing together enough of these snapshots, we can start to paint a picture of year-to-year climate variations over thousands of years. These images also provide a flavor of the fieldwork that we use to collect these samples, the variety of conditions we find the corals in, and even the difficulty of collecting the samples from them. Some are living in situ, while others are upside down or sideways, requiring us to core at all sorts of highly unnatural angles. A few of the corals, like the one on the bottom left, we found even had trees growing through them, really showing how long that they had been there. In doing this work, we are also guests in a new culture, and we're respectful for the local traditions and dress. So you can see me coring here in a Guam dress in the Marshall Islands. Working closely with our local collaborators, we hope that our research will really impact on-the-ground management of marine and freshwater resources in these low-lying island nations. For example, we use these living and fossil coral boulders like the one shown here to assess the frequency and intensity of these El Nino events and how they've changed in the past. Each coral provides information on how variable the ocean conditions were over its lifetime. Short windows of up to a few hundred years when the corals grew that provide information about El Nino and extreme events during that time. We can piece together enough of these corals and to compare them to modern conditions of living corals to show how the variability has changed in the past. So that's what's shown here in the middle. With a change in variability in these fossil corals in color, such that dots that are plot above that solid line indicate that variability during that window was higher than it is today, with dots below the line showing that variability was less than it is today. So we're applying this approach to a suite of fossil corals from the Marshall Islands to assess how variability changed in response to sunlight and volcanic activity over the past 1,000 years. We're still in the early stages of this research, and you can see the colors indicate the amount of years that we've actually sampled. So we still have hundreds of years of these corals to sample to really understand climate over the last 1,000 years. But for now, we can compare these initial results to our previous work further east in an island nation known as Kiribati to look at how El Nino has changed over time. So this is a similar plot now shown from this previous work at 3 islands further east of the Marshall Islands in the Central Pacific, shown here in red, blue, and green. Again, these are fossil corals, and the larger the dot, the longer the interval, and the more certain we can be of the estimate of past climate variability. So again, what's shown here is the change in variability such that anything above 0 is an increase in variability, and anything below 0 is a decrease. And what we find is twofold. First, we see that there was a decrease in variability between about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago relative to what it is today, which is shown by the dotted line across the figure, as well as that width of that gray bar. And this is as a result of small changes in the amount of incoming sunlight due to slow variations in the Earth's orbit around the sun. But we also see an amplification of variability in the last 5 decades, which is shown by that large width of that gray region. And this is relative to anything we've seen over the last 7,000 years. So the question becomes, are these extremes unprecedented? Comparing these changes to what we'd expect from natural climate variability alone, which is what's shown in the red bars of these figures, we find that these events are in fact more likely than we'd expect from just chance alone in a variable Earth system. with over a 99% probability that the last few decades are in fact unprecedented relative to anything we've observed in the last 7,000 years, emphasizing that these extremes are likely caused by human-induced climate change. Finally, in work led by my graduate student Emma Reed, we're also using this network of coral records to assess how that tropical Pacific rain belt has changed in its position, width, or intensity in response to past climate changes. This is important as, remember, it dictates the availability of fresh water in these low-lying island nations across the Pacific. So piecing together corals from all these sites outlined in black, we can reconstruct how the position of this rain belt has changed in the past, using the north-south gradient among these sites. This reconstruction shows how the rain belt contracts towards the equator during El Nino, leaving the Marshall Islands and other island nations under extreme drought conditions, exacerbating their already depleted freshwater supply. Like a baseball player on steroids, climate change has stacked the deck, making extremes more likely to occur. Combined with potentially unprecedented variability in the Pacific, these changes are likely to drive both extreme droughts and extreme floods all over the world. Tune in to Kevin Andrikaitis' lecture in a few weeks for more on the impacts of too much and too little water. So finally, from our work and the work of many climate scientists here at the University of Arizona and beyond, we know that our oceans are changing at unprecedented rates. But I wouldn't be here doing what I'm doing every day if I wasn't optimistic and hopeful about our future. We can also leverage this knowledge of how the oceans and ocean ecosystems have changed in the past to develop solutions for future resilience. Our group is applying what we've learned in the tropical Pacific to develop solutions for coral reef resilience in the Biosphere 2 ocean mesocosm, which is a 700,000-gallon ocean dedicated to innovative research and education on coral reef ecosystems. Specifically, we're applying what we've learned from history and decades of reef research to develop scalable solutions for building resilient coral reefs. That is, reefs that can recover from disturbance and maintain that critical structure and function that we talked about earlier that's required to provide essential goods and services for generations to come. These solutions can be applied to corals grown in nurseries and transplanted onto the reef in a process known as coral restoration. Our collaborators at Mote Marine Laboratory are global leaders in this process and have had over 95% survival of corals transplanted over the first few years. For example, we can intentionally heat stress corals, like the fragments of corals from our collaborators at Mote shown here in the middle, increasing their resistance to future extremes. One of the questions we hope to answer with this work is how long this resistance will last and how these heat-stressed corals will respond to predicted future ocean conditions. Similarly, shown here on the left, we can treat corals with probiotics, which are beneficial microorganisms that live on or within the coral colony and increase coral health, reduce their susceptibility to stress, and even help them grow. In collaboration with teams from Hawaii and Brazil, we have isolated beneficial microorganisms from Hawaiian corals and developed a probiotic solution that we will test here at the Biosphere 2. Such interventions will become critical as bleaching events become more frequent and extreme, and rising carbon dioxide levels make it increasingly difficult for corals to grow. In fact, it was here at the Biosphere 2 where scientists first showed that corals grow up to 40% slower under conditions that are now expected by 2050. As the oceans become more acidic and the abundance of one of those key building blocks of coral skeleton becomes increasingly scarce, it will undermine the structure and function of the coral reef ecosystems like the ones shown here. Nevertheless, corals are able to buffer against changing ocean conditions, actively increasing the pH and optimizing their own environment for rapid growth. Here is a simplified schematic of a coral organism, which are closely related to anemones that you might be familiar. With similar shape and structures, the tentacles that they use for feeding, and the mouth and anus that opens to a large stomach. Seawater can passively move through their stomach and through the coral cells, but they can also use energy that's trapped by that symbiotic algae that live in their tissue to fuel active transport of ions across these cell layers into that semi-isolated fluid from which they grow. And by doing so, they increase the pH and the concentration of those key building blocks of their skeleton, thus reducing the impacts of ocean acidification and buffering against these changes. But my recent work also demonstrates that there are strict physiological limits to this ability to buffer, rendering corals susceptible to continued ocean acidification. So actually using a completely independent approach to those early studies of the biosphere too, my work also shows that corals will grow about 40% slower under future ocean conditions, but this time with large spatial differences that are ultimately dictated by those climate patterns across the tropical Pacific. Where we go from here is up to us. We have to change our behavior and reduce greenhouse gas emissions and limit warming to avert the most disastrous effects of climate change. Well, we work here at University of Arizona and with our international collaborators to develop solutions to further increase societal and ecosystem resilience. To reach net zero emissions and limit warming to a few degrees Celsius, we need to change our emissions by about 2 to 3% each year over the next 50 years. To put this in context, this is estimated to be about a half the rate of emissions lost or decline projected for 2020 during the global pandemic. But these technologies exist and new and innovative solutions are continuously being developed. These challenges are going to require all hands on deck. So here we're also working with our partners in the Marshall Islands and the Tucson Unified School District to develop cross-cultural education programs to inspire change and train the next generation of solution scientists. Here's an example of some virtual reality experiences that we've developed at the Biosphere 2 to allow viewers to immerse quite literally in the Biosphere 2 ocean as well as the Marshallese reefs. Technology allows us to share these unique ecosystems with many here in the desert who have not seen the ocean, let alone a coral reef. To end, I want to leave you with a quote from yet another inspirational female ecologist. You cannot get through a single day without having an impact on the world around you. What you do makes a difference, and you have to decide what kind of difference you want to make. Jane Goodall. So we are intricately linked to the ocean on a daily basis, and in turn our actions impact the ocean. So it's up to each of us to decide what kind of difference we want to make.
Thank you for joining us for the second lecture in our series on water. We hope you can join us next week for our third lecture, Water the Colorado River, with Connie Woodhouse. The Colorado River is a vital surface water supply for the arid southwestern U.S., where the demand for water from the river now exceeds the supply. Next week in her talk, Connie Woodhouse will discuss how this arid lands river, one of the most highly developed in the world, is subject to natural climate variability and increasingly the impacts of a warming climate. Thank you to our presenting sponsor, Tucson Electric Power, and our series sponsors, Cost Communications, Halo Companies, Raytheon Missiles and Defense, Research Corporation for Science Advancement, Tucson Medical Center, and Visit Tucson. Your generous support is what makes this series possible.